The 16th of September, 1944, Westwall, near Aachen. Hauptmann Klaus Richter of the Fortress Engineer Corps ran a gloved hand over the interior wall of Bunker 17B. The concrete was cool, dense, and perfectly smooth, a triumph of material science and a testament to German craftsmanship. It felt like the bedrock of a mountain, eternal and unyielding. Through the narrow, splayed firing aperture, he could see the tangled, ancient trees of the Hürtgen forest, their leaves just beginning to burn with the yellows and reds of autumn. The air inside the casemate was a familiar cocktail of scents, the damp chill of subterranean construction, the sharp tang of ozone from the radio set, the faint, reassuring perfume of machine oil from the MG-42, nested in its steel embrasure, and the lingering aroma of the men's midday meal, a thin cabbage soup. Here, encased in 2 solid meters of beton B, a specialized, steel-reinforced concrete mix of his own Corps' design, buried under another meter of compacted earth, he felt a supreme, unshakable confidence. This was not a trench scraped in the mud, a temporary concession to the fortunes of war. This was a fortress, a permanent and defiant statement of German will, forged in steel and stone. This was the Siegfried Line, the Westwall, the dragon's teeth of the Reich. And he, Klaus Richter, a man who had helped build the great bridges of the Autobahn before the war, was one of its proud keepers. His work was meant to last for 1,000 years. His men, a hardened squad of veterans from the cauldron of the Eastern Front, shared his certitude. They were not fresh-faced boys from the Hitler Youth. They were grim, bearded men in their 30s, accustomed to hardship, privation, and the brutal calculus of victory. They moved with an economy of motion, their conversations sparse and cynical. They had seen the Soviet hordes throw themselves against German positions and had held. They viewed this concrete dragon not just as a shelter, but as an invincible shield, a weapon in its own right, designed to bleed an attacker white. The stories they heard about the Americans were a source of grim amusement. They were told the enemy was a polyglot army of amateurs, soft boys raised on chocolate and motion pictures, led by generals who had never heard a shot fired in anger. They had seen captured American equipment, a jeep, some food rations, and it confirmed their biases. Everything seemed too new, too clean, too disposable. They were not impressed. Here, in the gloom of the forest, the old virtues would be decisive. Here, tactics honed over centuries, and the superior fighting spirit of the German Lanzer would triumph over American matter. What they did not yet understand, what no one in the Wehrmacht high command in their map-lined bunkers truly grasped, was that the Americans were not coming to fight a battle of spirit or tactics. They were coming to prosecute a war of industrial physics. Their solution to the seemingly insurmountable problem of the Siegfried Line was not a complex tactical maneuver or a daring feat of arms, but a simple, brutal equation written in high explosives and steel. The M1 240mm howitzer, a mobile siege gun that fired a 345-pound shell. This weapon, a relic in concept but an absolute monster in execution, had been designed for a single, merciless purpose: to murder concrete fortifications. This was the moment the German army, master of the tactical duel, would learn that it was not engaged in a duel at all. They had brought a finely crafted rapier to a contest against a hydraulic press. The first sound was alien, a deep tremor that vibrated up through the soles of their boots. It was not the familiar, sharp crack of the German 88, a sound they knew and loved, nor the tearing silk scream of a 105mm field gun. It was a low, resonant thump that seemed to come from the horizon itself, a sound so deep and powerful it was felt in the bones more than heard with the ears. It had a weight to it, a sense of immense energy being displaced miles away. "What was that?" muttered a private named Schmidt, looking up from cleaning the MG-42's bolt. "Thunder?" Richter and his platoon leader, a grizzled Feldwebel, exchanged quizzical glances. The sky was a clear, crisp blue. "Too deep for a field gun," the Feldwebel grunted. "Naval bombardment, maybe? But we are 80 kilometers from the coast." Then came the other sound, a noise that methodically erased every soldier's prior experience of warfare. It began as a whisper, a faint disturbance in the upper atmosphere. and grew with horrifying speed. It was a deliberate, chugging rhythm, a monstrous tearing of the air. It sounded like a freight train, impossibly high in the sky, and it was coming straight for them. It was the sound of a colossal weight falling from a great height, gathering momentum, an object so massive it made the very air groan in protest. There was no time to process it, no time to connect the distant thump with this approaching apocalypse. There was no time to even shout a warning. The world did not explode. It was unmade. The impact of the 240mm shell on Bunker 17B was not an event to be witnessed, but one to be survived within its shockwave. Richter, standing 10 meters back from the embrasure discussing a wiring diagram with the Feldwebel, was lifted from his feet and thrown against the rear wall as if by a giant's invisible hand. The air in the bunker compressed instantly, becoming a solid, agonizing force that crushed his lungs, tried to pulp his internal organs, and forced the breath from his body in a single, involuntary gasp. The sound was not a sound, it was a physical entity, a white-hot spike of pressure that shattered his eardrums and plunged him into a universe of ringing silence. The bunker's electric lights, powered by a small generator, flickered and died. The world became a maelstrom of dust, choking concrete powder, and the absolute, terrifying dark of the tomb. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, there was only the sensation of immense, grinding pressure and the high-pitched, metallic scream of tormented steel as the rebar within the concrete stretched past its breaking point. He thought, in a moment of pure, animal terror, that the very geology of the earth had cracked open to swallow them whole. Slowly, agonizingly, his senses began to return, each one a new form of torture. The ringing in his ears was a constant, high-pitched shriek, blocking out all other noise. The air was thick and unbreathable, a hot, gritty paste of pulverized concrete that seared his throat and lungs with every shallow, desperate breath. He pushed himself up, his hands scraping against a coarse, gritty surface. It was the floor, but it was now canted at a sickening 30-degree angle. He fumbled for the heavy military torch on his belt, his fingers clumsy and numb. The beam switched on, a weak yellow spear cutting through the swirling, opaque dust. It revealed a scene from a madman's nightmare. The forward half of the bunker, the section with the machine gun embrasure where he had been admiring the view only minutes before, was simply gone. It did not exist anymore. Where there had been 2 meters of the finest reinforced concrete in the world, there was now a gaping, ragged hole opening directly into the forest, with the autumn sunlight streaming mockingly through the dust clouds. The great steel plate of the embrasure, weighing over a ton, had vanished. The MG-42, a marvel of mechanical engineering, had been vaporized into its constituent atoms. The 2 men who had been manning it, including the young private, Schmidt, were not dead in any conventional sense. They had been disassembled. A ghastly, wet, crimson film coated every remaining surface of the bunker, a silent testament to the unimaginable violence of the pressure wave. The Feldwebel lay nearby, a crumpled shape in the dark, his body twisted at an impossible angle, killed not by shrapnel, but by the sheer, brutal concussion that had slammed him against the wall. Stumbling like a drunkard, his sense of balance utterly destroyed, Richter made his way to the ragged edge of the new opening. The air outside was cool and clean, a shocking contrast to the suffocating tomb he had just escaped. He looked down, his engineer's mind trying to analyze, to comprehend, while the man inside him simply wanted to scream. The shell had not merely punched a hole. It had struck the earth-covered roof and detonated with such cataclysmic force that it had shattered the entire forward structure from the top down. The energy release had been so immense that it had turned the concrete itself into a secondary explosive force. Huge chunks of it, some the size of a small car, lay scattered for 50 meters around the entrance. He reached out and touched a piece of the thick steel reinforcing bar, the pride of his engineering corps. It was bent and twisted into a grotesque, modern sculpture, its ends splayed open like a metallic flower. The ground in front of the bunker was not a crater in the conventional sense. It was a depression, a wide, shallow bowl of pulverized earth and stone, as if a small meteor had struck. He understood then, with a chilling clarity that cut through his shock, the weapon hadn't just breached their defenses, It had erased them. It had treated 2 meters of military-grade, steel-laced concrete as if it were plasterboard. A second low thump rolled across the hills, the sound of a distant giant striking an anvil. Richter found himself cowering instinctively, his body anticipating a blow his mind could not yet accept. He grabbed a pair of binoculars from a pouch on the floor, his hands shaking, and forced himself to watch. His professional curiosity warring with his primal fear, he focused on Bunker 17C, half a kilometer to his right, another key node in their defensive line. Through the lenses, he could see 2 soldiers standing outside the entrance, smoking cigarettes, likely drawn out by the explosion, at his own position. They were looking in his direction, pointing, their body language a clear portrait of confusion. He watched, helpless, as a black speck appeared in the sky above them, descending from the heavens at a steep, almost vertical angle. It seemed to hang in the air for a moment, growing larger, a malevolent teardrop of steel. The men below never saw it. There was no whistle, no warning scream, just the horrifying chugging sound he now recognized. The speck touched the roof of the bunker. There was no flash of fire, not at first. There was only a colossal puff of grey dust and green earth as the shells smashed through the packed soil and the concrete cap. A heartbeat later, the entire structure swelled from within. The ground itself seemed to bulge upwards, and then the bunker detonated, not like a bomb, but like a volcano. A pillar of black smoke, shattered concrete, and raw earth geysered 100 feet into the air. The sound, even at this distance, was a deep, gut-punching crump that knocked the wind out of him and made the binoculars jump in his hands. The 2 soldiers who had been smoking cigarettes ceased to exist. He stood there, mute, as the lethal geometry of the attack became clear. The shells were plunging down from the heavens, striking the one place a fortification is most vulnerable, its roof. No flat-trajectory anti-tank gun could do this. No conventional field artillery had the weight to achieve this effect. This was something else entirely. This was siege warfare, the ancient art of breaking castles, but it had been brought to the modern battlefield with terrifying mobility and power. This was not a battle, it was an extermination. The Siegfried Line, the mighty rampart of the Reich, was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, by an enemy who refused to even engage it on its own terms. The confidence that had filled him only minutes ago now felt like a sick, childish fantasy. His belief in the superiority of German engineering, in the indomitable spirit of his men, collapsed into a black pit of despair. How do you fight a storm? How do you shoot at an earthquake? The Americans had created a weapon that didn't just kill soldiers or break forts. It crushed the very philosophy that had built them. In the relative safety of the sector command post, a deep, timber-braced dugout 3 kilometers behind the front line, the air was thick with confusion and a creeping dread. Reports were flooding in from field telephones and crackling radio sets, each more frantic than the last. Bunker 17. B is gone. Bunker 17. C has been obliterated. 18. A is no longer responding. The commanders, veterans of campaigns from Poland to France to Russia, could not make sense of it. Oberst Vogel, the sector commander, a stern-faced Prussian with iron-grey hair and an expression of profound disbelief, slammed a fist on his map table. They were accustomed to reports of bunkers being suppressed by fire, bypassed by infantry, even breached after days of sustained close-range assault by combat engineers. They were not accustomed to reports of them being annihilated from beyond the horizon in a matter of minutes. Richter, his face pale and caked with concrete dust, his uniform torn, was brought before Vogel. "Hauptmann," the Oberst began, his voice strained with a mixture of anger and anxiety. "What in God's name is happening out there? The reports are nonsensical. They speak of geological events, not artillery." "It is artillery, Herr Oberst," Richter said, his own voice hoarse and unfamiliar. He had to shout to be heard over the ringing in his ears. "But it is unlike anything I have ever encountered. The shells are immense. They do not explode on the fortifications. They pass through them. They detonate inside or underneath. They shatter the structure from within." "Impossible," another officer, a Major Brandt, with the precise, detached air of a staff college intellectual, scoffed. The concrete is 2 meters thick. Specification B. Nothing short of a direct hit from a 1,000-kilo bomb dropped by a Stuka could do that. And the sky is clear. This is not a bomb, it is a shell, Richter insisted, his engineering mind beginning to claw its way out of the terror, desperately seeking data, seeking reason. The trajectory is extremely high, almost vertical. That is the only way it could achieve the penetration. The velocity at impact it must be tremendous. I estimate the shell weight to be at least 150 kilograms, perhaps more. The officers stared at him. The heaviest German field howitzer, the 21 centimeters Mercer 18, fired a 113-kilogram shell, and it was a cumbersome beast, considered a heavy siege piece, difficult to deploy and supply. The idea of a mobile gun firing a shell significantly heavier was hard to credit. It seemed to violate the known principles of military engineering, a delicate balance of firepower, mobility, and logistical feasibility. For the next few hours, Richter was tasked with helping Major Brandt piece together the puzzle. He spoke with other day's survivors who trickled back, with forward observers who had witnessed the impacts from a safe distance, with signals intelligence who had been monitoring American radio traffic. The picture that emerged was more terrifying than his initial visceral experience. This was no secret superweapon that appeared in small numbers. American radio chatter, intercepted and hastily translated, spoke of entire battalions of these monster guns. They called them 240mm howitzers. The nickname the GIs used for them, overheard on a garbled transmission, was Black Dragon. 2 days later, a reconnaissance patrol, moving through the shattered forest under the cover of darkness, returned with a prize, the unexploded fuse, and a large, heavy fragment from one of the colossal shells, found embedded deep in the earth where a shell had missed its target. The fragment was nearly an inch thick, made of high-quality forged steel. Stamped onto its curved surface were the telltale markings of an American arsenal. The data was rushed to Richter's temporary desk in the command bunker. He and Major Brandt laid the information out under the harsh glare of a bare light bulb. It was then that the brutal mathematics of their defeat began to take shape. The weapon was the M1 240mm howitzer. A quick consultation of pre-war intelligence manuals on foreign armies and captured technical documents provided the horrifying specifics. The gun itself weighed 64,700 pounds, nearly 30 tons in its firing configuration. To move it, the Americans broke it down into 2 massive loads, each pulled by a heavy Mach No6X6' mover truck, a vehicle larger than any German equivalent. A dedicated, tracked crane, the T-16E1, was required simply to lift the barrel and breech onto the carriage to assemble the weapon for firing. The German military mind, obsessed with the lightning-fast mechanized warfare of the Blitzkrieg and its tenets of speed and surprise, reeled at the concept. This was not an elegant weapon system. It was a brute. It was a factory-sized piece of equipment that the Americans had somehow made mobile, treating it not as a rare siege piece to be used sparingly at places like Sevastopol, but as a standard corps-level asset, available on call. They had industrialized destruction. 30 tons, Major Brandt whispered, staring at the numbers as if they were a curse. They move it in 2 loads. The manuals say they can have it assembled and ready to fire in under 2 hours. Zwei Stunden. He shook his head in disbelief. We would need a dedicated railway line and a week to move a coastal defense gun of this size and get it emplaced. They do it with trucks, on a muddy road. It's the logistics, Major, Richter said, his voice flat. It is always the logistics with them. We build a perfect tank, the Tiger, but we can only produce a handful and cannot keep them fueled. They build a simple tank, the Sherman, and produce 50,000 of them. Then they examine the shell. The M114 high-explosive round weighed 345 pounds, or 156 kilograms. Richter's initial estimate had been conservative. The shell contained over 54 pounds, 24.7 kilograms, of raw TNT. Richter, his hands now steady, did a quick calculation on a notepad. The standard German 15 cm SFH-18 field howitzer, the workhorse of their own artillery corps, fired a shell containing roughly 10 pounds of explosive filler. The American weapon delivered 5 times the explosive payload. But that wasn't the whole story. The shell casing itself was a masterpiece of brutal engineering. It was thick, heavy, and designed not to fragment into shrapnel, but to hold together, using its immense kinetic energy from its plunging descent to penetrate deep into the earth or concrete before the delayed action fuse initiated the detonation. "You see, Klaus?" Brandt said, his voice a low monotone of academic horror, tapping the calculations. "It is not an explosion on the surface. It is a subterranean earthquake. The fuse is set to detonate a fraction of a second after impact. It smashes through the earth and concrete, and then it explodes. The shock wave is transmitted through the concrete itself, finding every microscopic flaw, every stress point. It doesn't need to punch a perfect hole. It simply needs to deliver enough energy to cause a catastrophic structural failure. The concrete spalls and shatters. The rebar snaps like uncooked spaghetti. The entire structure collapses on itself. It is diabolically simple. It's not a weapon. It's a demolition tool. The true scale of the American advantage, however, was not just in the gun or the shell, but in the vast invisible system that supported it. Each gun required a crew of 14 men. Each had a dedicated crane. Each was pulled by multiple heavy trucks. These trucks needed fuel, oceans of it, refined in Texas, shipped 3,000 miles across the sea in endless convoys of tankers. The shells, each one weighing as much as 2 men, had to be manufactured in factories in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, transported by rail to ports in New York and Virginia, loaded onto Liberty ships by the thousand, sailed across the Atlantic, unloaded in the rebuilt harbor of Cherbourg, then trucked hundreds of miles to the front line, right to the breech of the gun, and they were firing hundreds, thousands of these shells. Richter felt a wave of dizziness, the kind that comes from staring into an abyss. He looked at a map of the world pinned to the bunker wall. He saw Germany, a compact, powerful nation in the heart of Europe, its industry efficient but strained, its resources finite, its fuel reserves dwindling to nothing. Then he looked at the United States, a continent-spanning behemoth, separated by an ocean, with resources that were, for all practical purposes, infinite. It dawned on him with the force of a physical blow. The Germans had prided themselves on their superior engineering, on the technical marvels of their Tiger tanks and their V-2 rockets. But German engineering was the art of the exquisite, the creation of a perfect, complex machine in limited numbers by master craftsmen. American engineering was the art of the overwhelming, the creation of a simple, powerful machine in numbers so vast they defied comprehension, built by ordinary men and women on an assembly line. The Germans built masterpieces. The Americans built tidal waves. "We cannot win this," Richter said quietly, looking up from the data sheets. It was not an expression of fear or defeatism, but a simple statement of fact, an engineer's final, grim conclusion drawn from undeniable data. Brandt looked at him, his face etched with a weary resignation. "We have known this for some time, Klaus, in an abstract sense. We see the numbers of their tanks, their planes. We see the food their prisoners eat, the quality of their cigarettes. But this," he gestured to the data on the 240mm howitzer, "this is different. This is a weapon that negates our very strategy. The Westwall was our shield. It was meant to halt them, to bleed them white, to force them into a battle of attrition where our superior soldiers could triumph. But they are not fighting our soldiers. They are fighting our concrete. And they are winning." The realization settled over the command bunker, like a shroud of radioactive dust. The war was no longer a contest of tactics, or courage, or even technology, in the way they understood it. It was a war of production, of logistics, of raw materials. It was a simple, brutal mathematical problem, and Germany was on the wrong side of the equal sign. They had spent years building a shield, believing in its strength, only to have an enemy arrive who had calculated the exact energy required to shatter it, and had then built a machine for the sole purpose of delivering that energy. The Black Dragon was not just a gun, it was the physical manifestation of a different way of war, a way they were utterly unprepared for and could never hope to match. The days that followed were a living hell, a slow-motion descent into futility. The psychological impact of the 240mm howitzers, the Acht Zoll Kanone, as the terrified German troops began to call them, though their true caliber was larger, was far more devastating than their physical effects. The Siegfried Line ceased to be a fortress in the minds of the men tasked with defending it. It became a series of pre-dug graves. A new malady spread through the ranks, a specific form of shell shock the weary medics began to call Bettenfieber, concrete fever. Men stationed in the bunkers would sit in silence for hours, their eyes wide, listening, not for the sound of approaching tanks or the chatter of machine guns, but for that low, distant thump from the horizon, the sound that signaled the beginning of the end. Once it was heard, a dreadful countdown began in every man's head. 20 seconds, 30 seconds. A lifetime lived in the space between the firing of the gun and the arrival of the shell. Some men cracked, abandoning their posts and running screaming into the forest, choosing to face enemy infantry rather than wait to be entombed. Others became fatalistic, sitting blank-faced at their posts, making grim jokes about how the Americans would save the army the trouble of burying them. The entire German doctrine of static defense was rendered a tragic farce. What was the point of interlocking fields of fire when the position providing that fire could be removed from the face of the earth at a moment's notice? What was the purpose of thick concrete walls when the enemy possessed a key that could unlock them from 23 kilometers away? Command and control broke down. Runners were vaporized along with their command posts. Landlines were severed by the earth-shattering concussions. The intricate, carefully planned defensive network fell apart, bunker by bunker. Richter witnessed the systemic collapse firsthand. He was sent forward to assess the damage and report on the feasibility of holding the line. What he found was a shattered army. He saw a platoon of veteran panzer grenadiers, men who had held their ground against Soviet tank hordes on the Eastern Front, now huddled in an open ditch, refusing a direct order to occupy a nearby bunker. "We will die in the open, Hauptmann," their sergeant told him, his face a mask of exhausted defiance. "At least here the sky will be our headstone. In there is just a concrete coffin." The Americans, with a casual cruelty born of overwhelming power, seemed to know this. They began to use the howitzers for psychological torment. Sometimes they would fire a single shell every hour, on the hour, into a different section of the line, keeping the German defenders in a constant state of agonizing suspense. Other times, they would concentrate the fire of an entire battalion, 12 guns, onto a single stubborn concrete casemate that was holding up their advance. The effect was apocalyptic. Richter saw it happen to the command bunker of the 3rd Regiment. It was a formidable structure, dug deep into a hillside. The Black Dragons targeted it for 20 minutes. When the shelling stopped, the hill was still there, but it was misshapen, as if it had been punched by God. The bunker was gone. The entire reinforced concrete structure and the 50 men inside had been driven down into the earth, buried under thousands of tons of pulverized rock and soil. The German army was not being defeated. It was being erased from the landscape. The Ardennes offensive in December was a final, desperate gamble, a throwback to the glory days of 1940. It was a war of movement, of tactics, of German Geist against American matter. For a few weeks, it seemed to work, but the dream died in the cold forests of Belgium, not in a blaze of glory, but with the quiet sputtering of engines running out of fuel. The logistical reality of the war reasserted itself, and as the American counterattack began, the big guns returned. Richter, now attached to a Volkssturm unit in a desperate attempt to hold the line east of the Rhine, heard the familiar, dreaded sound once more. This time, the targets were not bunkers, but the towns and cities of the fatherland itself. The industrial logic had come home. He saw what a single 240mm shell could do to a block of civilian apartments. It was the same principle, the same brutal mathematics applied to a different target. The weapon did not care if the structure was a military fortification or a home for families. It only understood mass and energy. It only knew how to destroy. As he watched the methodical destruction, he understood the ultimate consequence of the American system. It wasn't just about winning a battle or conquering territory. It was about the total and utter dismantling of the enemy's ability to wage war. from their frontline bunkers to their factories, to the very will of their people. It was a form of warfare so total, so systemic, that it bordered on the abstract. The German soldier, raised on tales of heroic charges and cunning tactics, was now a mere variable in an industrial equation of demolition. His courage was irrelevant. His training was meaningless. He was simply mass to be acted upon by an opposing force. This realization was the final stage of the ideological collapse, the moment when the proud warrior culture of the Wehrmacht finally admitted it had been rendered obsolete. Years later, long after the noise of the guns had faded, Klaus Richter, now a civilian engineer helping to rebuild the shattered cities of the new Federal Republic of Germany, would occasionally find himself standing before a new construction project. He would watch the cranes lifting steel beams, the mixers pouring tons of fresh concrete, and the memory of the war would return to him, not as a nightmare of combat, but as a quiet, profound lesson in physics and philosophy. He was once asked by a young, earnest historian what the turning point of the war had been for him. The young man expected to hear about Stalingrad, or Normandy, or the Battle of the Bulge. Richter was silent for a long time, his old eyes looking at something far away, seeing the ghosts of twisted rebar and shattered concrete. "It was not a battle," he finally said, his voice soft. "It was a sound, and then it was a mathematical problem that I could not solve." He paused, tapping his finger on a blueprint for a new bridge, a symbol of peaceful creation. "We were masters of the craft of war. We designed the most intricate shields, forged the sharpest swords. Our soldiers were trained to be artists in the duel of combat. We took immense pride in our work, in the elegant lethality of our machines, and the peerless courage of our men. We saw war as a test of will, a crucible of national character." He looked the young historian in the eye, his gaze conveying a weariness that transcended time. "We prepared for a contest of warriors. We never imagined the enemy would not send a warrior to meet us. They sent a system. They sent a factory. When we challenged them at the gates of our fortress, they did not storm the walls. They did not try to pick the lock. They did not even seem to care about the men inside. They simply calculated the tonnage of reinforced concrete in the wall, determined the kilojoules of energy required to pulverize it, and then they built a machine that delivered that exact energy with cold, mathematical precision. We stood there in our bunkers, waiting for a soldier to fight," he concluded, his voice barely a whisper. "But we were not fighting soldiers. We were fighting the assembly line. We were fighting an industrial continent that had weaponized the very concept of mass. We learned, too late, that you cannot win a duel against an avalanche.